The 18th of October 1944 morning, inside Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Somu Toyota bent over maps of the Philippines as signal traffic crowded the room. Lamps burned above the charts, and clerks carried orders through the stale air. Toyota commanded the combined fleet, Japan's remaining naval strength, and Shogo was his answer to the landing at Leyte. He activated the operation, sending the northern force forward as bait, while the center force drove toward Leyte Gulf. The calculation was blunt. American carriers were treated as power tied to fixed advanced bases. Power Japanese movements could force into a predictable response. On the 20th of October 1944, at Leyte, American troops came ashore while carrier aircraft remained overhead, far from any shore airfield. The orders kept moving across the Pacific. In Tokyo, the map still showed an enemy Toyota believed he could draw where he wanted. On the 25th of October 1944, east of Cape Engano, the certainty behind Shogo met an American system that had already escaped the limits Japan assigned to it. Service Squadron 10 stood behind a mobile support network. By nightfall, 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk in the northern battle, and combined fleet had lost effective sea control. That outcome was not confined to the waters around Cape Engano. On the 23rd of September 1944, American forces seized Ulithi Atoll. Its lagoon became a major forward fleet base, but it was a staging point, not a boundary. American carrier strength could strike toward the Philippines, while Japan spent fuel, merely bringing its own forces toward battle. For Toyota, the stakes were the sea road between Japan and the Philippines. Shogo placed the northern force in harm's way to draw American attention north. The center force was meant to reach Leyte Gulf. Each movement demanded fuel Japan could no longer regard as an ordinary reserve. The ocean was no longer empty distance. It was a burden carried by every Japanese hull that had to reach the fight and then survive long enough to matter. Service Squadron 10 gave the American Pacific Fleet a different condition. Its ships could receive fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and repair support without returning to a shore base. That fact was visible before the northern battle reached its end. American carriers stayed at sea, stayed armed, and remained present over an invasion coastline beyond the fixed bases Japanese planning expected them to need. Ulithi changed the map without becoming the map. From that anchorage, the American fleet could move west again, leaving Japan to measure operations against the tanker system already shrinking under the demands of war. Toyota still possessed ships, staffs, and an operational design. What he no longer possessed was a sea that forced the enemy to stop. Combined fleet signal traffic held to Shogo's demand for a decisive response. 4 Japanese carrier divisions had been committed to the operation. The signal traffic could send them forward, but it could not make the Pacific small again. On the 20th of October 1944, the landing at Leyte continued, while Toyota's orders sent Japanese formations toward a battle area already covered by American carrier power. The beachhead was not the center of his plan. Leyte Gulf was. If the center force reached it, Japan could still impose the decisive encounter its naval command had prepared to fight. Across the Philippine waters, Japanese ships moved with the weight of that expectation. Their commanders had to preserve fuel for movement, battle, and withdrawal. Every course change carried a cost. Every hour at sea narrowed the margin available to a fleet that had to cross vast water before it could strike. The American fleet moved under a different condition. It did not need to retreat from the Western Pacific merely because an invasion had begun. Service Squadron 10 made its presence felt in what Japanese planners could see but could not answer. Carrier aircraft remained over Leyte, warships remained available beyond it. The fleet's reach did not end where the nearest advanced base ended. On the 25th of October 1944, east of Cape Engano, the Northern Force still served its assigned purpose. It was meant to pull American strength away from Leyte and open a path for the center force. The plan depended on timing, distance, and the belief that American carriers could be made to react inside Japanese calculations. Toyoda's command had committed its remaining surface strength to that belief. The map table in Tokyo had become an ocean crowded with separate forces, each moving toward a result no signal could guarantee. Japan had ships at sea, but possession was not freedom. A fleet that could not remain where it needed to be could not command the water it crossed. Combined fleet orders still drove the Northern Force onward. 4 carriers would be lost east of Cape Engano. Behind Toyoda's final calculation stood a naval faith formed long before Shogo was ever named. On the 27th of May 1905, in the Tsushima Strait, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet. Japan had concentrated its force, handled it with discipline, and won the kind of fleet action naval officers remembered for generations. The victory gave the service more than ships and prestige. It gave it a governing belief. Control of the Western Pacific could be decided when a prepared fleet met an enemy fleet at the chosen moment. That belief survived into the carrier age. On the 7th of December 1941, off Oahu, the First Air Fleet sent aircraft against Pearl Harbor from 6 fleet carriers. The opening blow proved that carriers could carry Japanese striking power across an ocean and deliver it without warning. Japanese naval aviation had trained for long-range attack, torpedo delivery, and the destruction of an opponent before he could assemble his strength. Combined Fleet inherited both victories. Its officers expected a climactic engagement, then a settlement imposed by the fleet that had prepared best. Carrier doctrine, night fighting confidence, and torpedo skill all served that expectation. The enemy would enter Japanese waters, Japanese forces would concentrate, and a decisive battle would determine who commanded the sea lanes. Yet Japan's oceanic navy depended on oil moving over those same sea lanes. Its tankers had to reach the fleet, survive the crossing, and return for more. In 1944, at Linga Roads, Japanese heavy units gathered under the limits imposed by fuel shortages. Training and movement no longer belonged to commanders alone. They depended on oil that had to arrive across an increasingly dangerous ocean. Admiral Sumu Toyoda inherited an institution trained to regard concentration as the answer. Its doctrine still spoke with the certainty of Tsushima. The decisive battle remained its answer. 6 fleet carriers had carried that faith to Oahu. In June 1944, over the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation still went out to meet the American fleet. Flight decks sent aircraft away from their carriers, commanders sought contact, and the old structure of battle remained visible. Japan still possessed carriers, trained aviators, and a doctrine built around striking first at an enemy fleet before it could impose its own decision. For Combined Fleet, the launch itself carried meaning. A carrier force had sortied. Aircraft had crossed open water toward an enemy formation. The battle had the shape Japanese naval planning recognized. The sea had not yet erased the possibility that a concentrated blow could restore control of the operational map. The American fleet remained beyond a fixed shore base. Its decks continued to receive returning aircraft. Its warships continued to move across water. Japan had expected distance and fuel demands to regulate. Japanese commanders could see carrier power still present after the first attacks, but they could read that endurance as the ordinary persistence of a powerful fleet. Later in 1944, at Linga Roads, Japanese heavy units faced a different form of restriction. Fuel shortages constrained training and movement before the fleet could even seek battle. A carrier doctrine designed for concentration now had to account for the oil required to bring each ship to the decisive area. The fleet could still move, it could still launch, but every movement consumed the reserve needed for the next one. Admiral Sumu Toyoda commanded a service that, still recognized the carrier sortie as proof that decisive battle remained possible. Japanese aircraft had launched on the 19th of June. On the 24th of October 1944, in Philippine waters, Japanese commands continued shogo under American carrier pressure spread across the battle area. 127 days had passed since the carrier launches in the Philippine Sea. The Japanese fleet had sought battle in June. American carrier wakes still moved west in October. The figures marked endurance that Japanese planning had not placed on its map. On the 18th of October 1944, in Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyota activated shogo and committed the northern force to draw American attention away from Leyte. The consequence was immediate and concrete. A carrier formation was assigned to act as bait, not preserved as a reserve. Toyota accepted that risk because the plan required American carriers to move north on Japanese terms. On the 24th of October 1944, in Philippine waters, Combined Fleet continued the center force drive toward Leyte Gulf. That order committed a second major formation to the decisive encounter, even as American carrier power remained active over a widening area. The center force had one task. It had to reach Leyte Gulf before the operational design came apart. Toyota's command kept both forces moving because battle still appeared to offer an answer. 127 days after the Philippine Sea, the American fleet was still operating far from the fixed bases Japan had expected to contain it. On the 12th of October 1944, east of Formosa, Task Force 38 began its attacks against Japanese airfields, shipping, and military positions. Japanese commands watched American carrier groups operate far beyond the shore installations. Combined Fleet had expected to define their reach. The loss was not merely aircraft and targets. Japan lost the freedom to wait for the fleet to come back within range of a fixed base. American task groups moved on after each strike. Their support ships followed behind them, passing fuel through hoses, ammunition by cargo net, food and stores across the water, while the warships remained underway. A Japanese force could still sortie from a protected anchorage. It could not make the same sustained movement without spending fuel that could not be replaced at the same rate. By the 14th of October, the attacks around Formosa had widened the operational area again. Japanese air units were ordered into repeated responses, while naval staffs measured fuel against distance, speed, and the need to preserve enough oil for shogo. The fleet lost defensive space. It could no longer choose a single area, assemble at leisure, and assume the enemy would arrive exhausted. Service Squadron 10 turned that condition into a permanent American advantage. It coordinated the fleet service force supporting the carriers, but its work was visible in results rather than headquarters language. A damaged item could be repaired. An empty magazine could be refilled. A carrier air group could continue flying. Each completed transfer removed another reason for the American fleet to withdraw. Japan's tanker shortage cut more deeply than one missed delivery. It reduced training before battle, narrowed the routes commanders could choose, and made every high-speed movement a decision against the next operation. Japanese heavy ships still had guns, torpedoes, and crews. What they had less of with each movement was endurance. In the waters west of the Marianas, Japanese staffs had once calculated distance as a barrier. By October, distance had become an expense paid mainly by Japan. American carriers could strike Formosa, move south toward the Philippines, and remain supplied without waiting for a shore depot to catch up. The officers directing the northern force could only face the result in first person. We are being asked to spend strength that will not return. On the 22nd of October 1944, Task Force 38 replenished at sea before moving back toward the battle area. At Manus in October 1944, The answer to the endurance visible since the Philippine Sea was already organized behind the carriers. Service Squadron 10 did not send a single convoy after a single operation. It sustained a fleet service system of oilers, ammunition ships, stores ships, repair vessels, and forward anchorages that could keep pace with the moving offensive. Rear Admiral Worrell Reed Carter commanded Service Squadron 10 as the carrier force ranged west. The important fact was not that an anchorage existed. Japan possessed anchorages too. The difference was that American support could leave the anchorage, meet the fleet, transfer what it needed, and send it forward again. The carrier force did not have to choose between fighting and returning to a base. That was why the figure of American endurance never closed. Japanese planners had seen the carriers remain active after the Philippine Sea and then appear across the approaches to Leyte. The same force was not surviving on a reserve carried at the start of one sortie. It was being renewed while at sea. The tankers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels made repetition possible. Combined, fleet understood enough to alter its choices. It concentrated what fuel it had. It held heavy units at Linga Roads until movement became necessary. It sent the northern force north as bait and drove the center force toward Leyte Gulf because a drawn-out contest favored an enemy that could restore its own striking power offshore. Those adjustments did not restore control. A Japanese formation could conserve fuel only by surrendering speed, range, training, or time in the battle area. It could move fast only by reducing what remained for withdrawal and the next sortie. The operational gamble inside Shogo came from that shrinking choice. Japan had to force a decision before its own fleet consumed the ability to keep seeking one. On the 23rd of October 1944, the center force entered Palawan Passage on its way toward Leyte. Its movement was no longer part of a flexible campaign. It was a commitment made with little room to recover from delay, loss, or diversion. The officers of Combined Fleet could state the position without confusion. We must seek battle now, because waiting gives the enemy another day at sea. 2 days remained before the northern force was destroyed east of Cape Engano. In the early hours off Cape Engano, the northern force still followed the purpose assigned to it. Vice Admiral Yusaburo Ozawa had brought his carriers north to draw American strength away from Leyte Gulf. The force had flight decks, escorts, and the authority of Combined Fleet behind it. What it did not have was the trained carrier air strength needed to meet the American fleet on equal terms. Zuikaku was the last surviving carrier from the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Zuiho carried out the same assignment beside her. Chitose and Chiyoda were converted light carriers. Their decks were now part of a decoy force, sent toward the American carriers because Shogo required a diversion more than Japan could preserve a reserve. American carrier aircraft reached the northern force in successive attacks. Japanese ships turned, maneuvered, fired anti-aircraft weapons, and attempted to keep their formations together. The carriers could not create fighters that were no longer available, nor could their escorts replace a flight deck once bombs and torpedoes had made operations impossible. Chitose went down first. Zuiho followed. Chiyoda was left disabled after air attack and was later sunk by American surface ships. Zuikaku, hit repeatedly, remained afloat long enough for her crew to fight the damage before she sank. Each loss removed a carrier that Combined Fleet had committed for the decisive action it still expected Shogo to produce. The reversal was complete before the operation could deliver its intended result. The northern force no longer existed as an effective carrier striking force. Admiral Soimu Toyota remained commander of Combined Fleet, but his command no longer possessed a carrier arm able to contest the sea on equal terms. The plan had used its carriers to pull American strength away. The American fleet had taken the carriers instead. The material position built before the battle now showed its final effect. American carriers had remained operational across the Philippine waters because they could receive fuel, ammunition, food, spares, and repair support at sea. Japan's shrinking tanker system had already narrowed its training, movement, range, and staying power. Shogo had been fought inside those limits. 4 carrier names remained as the measure of the break: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, all sunk. The northern force had lost the decks from which Japan expected to influence the battle for Leyte. On the 26th of October 1944, the battle was over, but the American fleet remained operational in Philippine waters. The surviving Northern Force staff could only describe the emptiness in first person. We have no carrier force left to send against them. The 26th of October 1944 marked the day the American fleet was still at sea and the Japanese flight decks were gone. It had become a final ledger. Japan had lost 25 aircraft carriers during the war. More than 8 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping had been destroyed. The figures did not describe a fleet able to rebuild its reach. They described an empire whose oil, cargo, replacements, and remaining naval strength could no longer move securely across the ocean. After the October carrier defeat, Combined Fleet could not